Hello, Holistic School in Taiwan. My talk today is called Our School Systems Are Not Working, Some Proposals for Change. I'm very pleased to be invited to give this talk at the Holistic School in Taiwan. We think of it as the Summerhill School of Asia, and to follow in the eminent footsteps of my good friends Yakov Hecht and Kageki Asakura. My name is Derry Hannam, and I was a secondary teacher, vice principal, secondary school inspector in the English state system for 35 years, always trying to challenge the traditional authoritarian methods. I've just finished a book about my experience of introducing democratic methods into a class and then a whole school, entitled Another Way is Possible, Becoming a Democratic Teacher in a State School. It's just been published as an e-book by Smashwords. Well, that's the plug. Now I work closely with networks of democratic alternative schools that are growing around the world. I support their creation and survival and attempt to import their thinking into state systems. I was privileged to be able to take part in the successful defence of Summerhill School against the attempts of the UK government to close it a few years ago. I regard schools such as Summerhill and the Holistic School as being pioneers of possibility. Because of their independence, they can dare to be beacons of light, to shine the way forward for the rest to follow. I really enjoyed reading the article about the Holistic School written by Yongxian Fum in 2015. In this talk, I'll argue that the time has come for the kind of education that you and I believe in, an education that truly recognises the genius of every child, an education that rejects coercion, rote learning, anxiety, and endless testing, and instead allows for the natural flow of learning through curiosity, creativity, and collaboration, that encourages self-directed learning in a context of participatory democracy and respect for human rights. Quite unlike my own experience of school, where I describe learning about democracy and rights as being the equivalent of reading holiday brochures in prison, I will argue that such a self-directed education is not only the human right of every young person, but also what is needed for our economic, environmental, and social survival as civilized societies. Your system in Taiwan scores highly on international league tables, such as that of the OECD, PISA. Yet I believe there is widespread unease about its traditional emphasis just on examination grades as the only measure of successful education. Despite this unease, I think there are still many crammers in Taiwan. Do you call them buxiban? Is that the right word? Together with high levels of student anxiety and unhappiness. The situation is similar in England. We have the unhappiest school students in Europe. We don't have the crammer schools, the buxiban, yet, but we certainly have politicians who want more hours to be spent on academic subjects. On the other hand, at least some of your leaders seem to be saying that your system needs improvement, with more emphasis on issues such as gender inequality, human rights, and freedom of speech. I wish this was true in my country, where the English School Minister of Education has recently told schools that capitalism is not to be questioned in class. Most importantly, I think some Taiwanese parents and teachers, though perhaps not yet enough, want change, and I look forward to learning more about this in the discussion. When I was an inspector, my work involved reading the brochures and mission statements of many state schools. They often sounded quite good, quite imaginative. Their statements about the purpose of education I could often agree with. They talked about preparing their students for becoming citizens in a democratic society, preparing students for worthwhile careers in the workplace, preparing students to be lifelong learners. Usually they also claimed to be developing the full potential of every student. All very good, you might think. The only trouble was that when I got to the school to carry out the inspection, I found that usually almost none of this was true. Far from learning about democracy, I found that not only did the students have very little opportunity to participate in any meaningful discussion or decision-making about their learning or about the school as a whole, but neither did the teachers. Most head teachers behaved like authoritarian dictators, and still do in my country. The teachers had little say over what or even how they would teach, and the students were not only told what to do all day long, they were pursued after school with homework, over which they had almost no choice or control. Even if there was a students' council, it was rarely allowed to discuss anything that challenged the authority of the head teacher, and if it did, its decisions would be ignored. Yet I learned from many years working with the Council of Europe Education for Democratic Citizenship project that learning about democracy has to be experiential as well as conceptual to be effective. Just listening to teachers talk about democracy is not enough. The information goes in one ear and out of the other. It has to be lived in the everyday life of the school, or it is indeed reading holiday brochures in prison. So, not much learning to become a democratic citizen. So what about learning for the workplace? Well, most secondary schools taught subjects to single-age classes that had little relation to real life, often in groups defined by ability, in a schedule or timetable of 1 hour periods of time or something similar. Sometimes the time would be longer for mathematics or science because they were very important subjects, and shorter for music or drama or art because they were not at all important. In some English schools, these art subjects are disappearing altogether. Well, what has this got to do with any workplace that you've ever seen? Groups of workers of the same age, marshalled, marching from one building to another every hour by a bell. The head teachers would admit when challenged that this was true, that this behaviour had nothing to do with the workplace. But they'd claim that the learning and testing was preparing students to get good exam grades that would eventually lead to highly paid prestigious careers. But for how many, I would ask? Well, for some of those who get to the best universities would be the reply. But what about all the others, I would ask? What about the young people with a gift for music or painting or gardening or caring for old people? The head teacher would then tell me that it was the government that I worked for that was forcing him or her to judge the success of the school by its academic examination results. And of course that would be true. The government showed little interest in curiosity, creativity, collaboration, or communication, the skills that many employers ask for. I suppose because they're too difficult to grade in examinations. Though interestingly, I was once ordered by the government, when it was planning to introduce citizenship education into the curriculum, to do some research to see if the few state schools that did listen to the voices of the students and include them in real decision making, and did give the students some responsibility and choice in their learning, did these schools get better or worse results than other schools in similar socio-economic environments? Well, I could only find 20 schools like this out of 3,500 English secondary schools, but the results were encouraging. The more democratic schools got better final examination results, better attendance, and had fewer exclusions for antisocial behaviour than the average for all the other schools in similar social areas. Unfortunately, my report, which was known as the Hannam Report and is still available online, although it had some effect on the curriculum in some schools for a while, it was substantially ignored by most schools and then forgotten by a new Conservative government. So, schools were hardly preparing students for the workplace, apart perhaps from the minority that most suited academic study. And even many of these were made anxious and unhappy by the pressure which did nothing to support deep learning. Well, what about lifelong learning? Okay, I must have talked with thousands of students in my 200 inspections. The picture was depressing. The students would say, "It's all been so boring and so anxiety-making that once I'm out of here, I want to forget about school learning forever." And of course, as we all know, that's exactly what happens. We forget nearly all the stuff we've learned for examinations because we were not intrinsically interested, but purely extrinsically motivated by the examination grades. So much for preparation for lifelong learning, more like lifelong forgetting. So what about developing the whole human being by encouraging their interests and passions? Well, honestly, in most schools, it just didn't and doesn't happen. There's no time to listen to the students, to find out what interests them and what they love to do and to learn. The academic pressure controls everything. Do you recognise the picture that I'm painting? So what is to be done? I have 4 key suggestions. Well, 3. Number 1. Governments should create departments for alternative education within their ministries of education. These alternative education departments should actively encourage and provide funding for a national network of alternative schools, such as the Holistic School, Summerhill, Sudbury Valley School, or Hadira School, that would become part of an international idea-sharing network, perhaps like UDEC or IDEC or APDEC or the European Sudbury Valley Schools Network. These networks have already done this for the largely private democratic schools. They are in touch with each other. So these alternative education departments should develop then some initial teacher training programs to prepare young teachers for working in more democratic environments. And they should liaise with universities to initiate more research interest into democratic approaches. At the same time, these alternative education departments should ensure that a specialist team of inspectors are developed who have the competence to inspect such schools, to ensure child protection and building safety, for example, and to ensure that the schools are doing what they claim to be doing. I'm not opposed to accountability if state funding is being used, so long as the inspectors understand what they're inspecting. We have a tiny handful, of such experimental schools within our English state system. You could try Googling for the XP School in Doncaster or School 21 in London. Here, project-based learning with much student choice in creating learning pathways and a degree of democratic participation is to be found, though still burdened with examinations at 16 and 18 over which the students have little choice. Sadly, these schools do not have strong official support. In fact, there's a general sense of disapproval from some government ministers and inspectors who seem to almost want them to fail. The situation in some other European countries is more encouraging. In the Netherlands, for example, there's a network of schools like the Agora School in Roermond. This network is emerging with much more emphasis on students identifying and following their interests in buildings that facilitate learning rather than class teaching. They have very few rooms that look like conventional classrooms. There are still final examinations which students must prepare for, but these schools feel quite different and non-coercive compared to traditional schools. Also in the Netherlands, the government is considering providing state funding for the growing network of private democratic schools. In fact, the Dutch inspection system now uses alternative schools in order to train and educate new inspectors. This is very encouraging. In Finland, the whole school system is moving away from coercion towards student choice and control, with emphasis on project-based learning and a degree of student democracy. In part, this is achieved through active national school student organisations for Finnish, Swedish and Sami-speaking young people. Similar developments are happening in Norway and to some extent in the nearby Baltic state of Estonia. In Israel, there is probably the most developed network of state-funded, fully democratic schools in the world, where students are entirely in control of their own learning, and it is their choice whether to work for state examinations or not. The wonderful Hadira School, founded by Yaakov Hecht, is a perfect example. So my first proposal is an alternative department for alternative education that would fund students to go to private schools and encourage the development of state schools that were alternatives. My second proposal for government is to require all schools, state and private, to allocate at least 20% of curriculum time for all students to practice self-directed learning around their own interests and passions. This could be one whole day or 2 half days per week, or just 20% of time within subject lessons. Schools should be free to negotiate with their teachers and students in a 20% committee how this programme would be organised and managed. 1 or 2 state schools in England have created elective programmes for half a day a week, which would be 10% of time, which involve mixed age groups in activities agreed between staff and students. These are very successful and greatly improve the quality of relationships in the school. The negotiation process is in itself an education to democracy. The activities also draw in parents and other members of the local community. But why stop at 10%? Let's go to 20%. As students learn to take responsibility for their own learning, they begin to develop the skills that really do prepare them for employment. In one school that I inspected, some of the elective activities were led by students themselves. A parent told me that their children would get off their deathbeds to get to school on electives day, even if they were ill. In fact, part of my job as an inspector was to check the student attendance figures for each half day of the week. The highest figure for attendance was consistently for electives afternoon on Wednesdays. I also checked the school's examination record, and it was significantly better than might have been expected for a school in such a poor area. A recent publication on the future of teacher training from the well-respected Economist Intelligence Unit, called Staff 2030, The Future of Teacher Training, recommends 20% time for student-directed learning in all schools. It points out that the skills that such an approach develops are precisely the skills required by the workplace for the fourth industrial revolution, which it describes as a post-industrial landscape where intangible forms of capital like algorithms, data and software are creating wealth which require new self-directed competencies in young people. Well, if they need to be self-directed in the workplace, they need to learn to be self-directed in school. Some forward-looking companies, usually but not always in the fast-growing high-tech industries of the fourth industrial revolution, such as Google, already provide their staff with 20% of their paid workplace time to develop projects that interest them, that are not directly related to the company's projects. Susan Wojcicki, now CEO of YouTube, created Gmail in her 20% time when she was at Google. Her mother, Esther Wojcicki, is a senior teacher at Palo Alto High School in Silicon Valley, California. She advocates 20% time to introduce self-directed learning into the timetable. She argues that this should be innovation or moonshot time, where students are given freedom to come up with their own ideas of what they want to do, what they want to study, and how they want to do it. This has led to the 20 Time project spreading through more middle and high schools in California under the slogan, "Your students will be future ready if you give them the time." Well, I totally agree with that. The Pareto Principle, named after the esteemed late 19th century Italian economist Vilfredo Pareto, is interesting. It specifies that 80% of consequences frequently come from 20% of the causes, asserting an unequal relationship between input and output. Well, I wouldn't mind betting that 80% of student learning would be generated in the 20% self-directed time if we could make it happen. Of course, the democratic schools movement has already reversed the 20% self-directed time and 80% provided curriculum time to at least 80% self-directed and 20% prescribed. And in many cases, of course, the democratic schools have moved nearer to 100% for self-directed time. This is precisely why I believe the democratic education movement is in touch with the future, while most mainstream school systems stagger on like collapsing dinosaurs. The students from the democratic schools and perhaps the 20% schools, if we had them, would know how to take control and responsibility for their own learning, how to be curious, creative, collaborative, and communicative. It's how the young human is born. We're born with these qualities until school systems get to work on us. I once upset some head teachers in Poland by saying that it's almost impossible to stop children learning, but schools manage it somehow. I exaggerated, of course, but maybe not that much. In our democratic schools, the students also learn how to participate in democratic communities that are grounded in human rights, where they can create their own identities out of their personal passions and interests, rather than just defining themselves by their examination grades. As paid employment declines in the future, this will enable students who've been to this kind of school to define themselves as unique individuals, to know what their talents and good qualities are, to know what they're good at, and not just rely on full-time paid work as the basis of their identity. It seems to me also that there'll have to be some form of universal basic income to replace benefits and salaries to support future democratic societies. Well, this brings me to my third proposal for government. After creating the Alternative Education Department, funding private democratic schools, introducing 20% self-directed time for all students in all schools, the next step would be to support the creation of schools within schools in many large state schools. To create a democratic, alternative, self-directed school within the big mainstream state school. These would offer parents, students, and teachers the choice of a democratic school as a separate unit within a large conventional school, where self-directed learning would be the norm. Some teachers and some students could spend some time in the self-directed school and some time in the mainstream school, if that's what they wanted. There's a history of such schools in the United States, where, inspired by the ideas of Lawrence Kohlberg and his vision of just community schools, a number of schools within schools were created within large high schools at Brookline and Scarsdale near Boston. Recently, the idea has spread to Europe, with the creation of similar schools in London, England, and Tallinn, Estonia. The schools within schools are essentially the democratic schools which we know and love, but having to meet the interesting challenge of existing in the direct proximity or of even sharing a building with a traditional school. Managing the interface between the two can be both difficult and fruitful, as my friend Charlie Marino Romero is learning at his school in Tallinn in Estonia, the name of which just by chance translates as Summerhill School. But I'm nearly out of time, and just before I close, having set out what is wrong with what we have and made some suggestions as to how we can move to a better place, I would like to end on a note that gives me great hope. All around the world, inspired by that young, wonderful 16-year-old Swedish girl, Greta Thunberg, we are seeing a demand for change coming from young people themselves. This is around the issue, of course, of sustainability and climate change. In England, it has led to a campaign entirely organised by young people called Teach the Future. In the face of the challenges of climate change, the students themselves are demanding a more relevant, joined up and student-directed school curriculum in schools that are fully green in terms of energy and building construction and the way in which the school operates, and that these schools should become the base for action in their communities to produce a more sustainable way of life that can tackle the issues of climate change. So I'll finish there because these young people really do give me hope. I'm sure you have such young people in Taiwan, and I hope you will give them your support. Thank you very much for listening.